One quote, buried in an old fan forum thread about Mikel Arteta, sums up everything you're about to hear: working under Pep doesn't just make you a better coach. It can make you resent him for the rest of your life. That's not a throwaway line. That's the emotional residue of an entire coaching philosophy, one built on control, precision, and an almost obsessive demand for tactical obedience. And if it can leave that mark on a protégé who adored him, imagine what it did to the players who didn't fit the system at all. Pep Guardiola is, by nearly every measurable standard, the greatest club manager of his generation. Trophies. Treble-winning seasons. A footballing philosophy so influential it rewired how the entire sport thinks about possession. That part of the story gets told constantly. What doesn't get told nearly as often is the other side of that brilliance: the players who arrived with reputations, medals, and star status, and who Guardiola simply decided didn't belong. Not because they weren't good enough. Because they weren't useful enough, in his very specific, very unforgiving vision of the game. 5 players. 5 different clubs, countries, and eras. Same pattern, every time. Arrive. Get evaluated. Get used, until the system no longer needs what you offer. Then get frozen out, sidelined, or shipped out, sometimes mid-prime, sometimes without a real explanation. This is the story of the 5 players Pep Guardiola effectively decided he was done with, and what that says about the man behind the trophies. Let's start in Barcelona, 2009. A club that had just won everything. A World Player of the Year on the books. And a manager already quietly planning to make him disappear. Zlatan Ibrahimovic arrived at Camp Nou that summer in one of the biggest transfers in the world, a forward who had bullied his way through Serie A player built on power, unpredictability, and an ego to match his talent. On paper, it looked like Barcelona had added the final piece. In reality, Guardiola had already started building a different picture in his head, one with no obvious space for a 6'5" target man who liked to operate on instinct rather than instruction. The early signs weren't dramatic. They were quiet. Training ground positioning. Team talks that referenced movement and fluidity in ways that never quite included Zlatan's game. Then came the season-defining shift. Guardiola began restructuring the entire attack around one player, Lionel Messi, pushed centrally, given license to roam, given the freedom that used to belong, structurally, to the striker. Zlatan wasn't dropped in a single dramatic scene. He was slowly, deliberately, edited out of the picture. Minutes reduced. Role diminished. And according to accounts that have circulated for years since, a growing personal frost between the two men, Ibrahimovic reportedly feeling disrespected, misled, and eventually discarded by a manager who barely spoke to him directly about any of it. By the time the next transfer window opened, Zlatan was gone, loaned, then sold, to AC Milan. One season. One trophy-laden but conflict-heavy year. And a parting that, by most reported accounts, left Ibrahimovic with lasting resentment toward the way he'd been treated, not cut for lack of quality, but cut because he didn't move the way Guardiola's system demanded. Case 1, closed. Pattern, established. Case 2 takes us backward slightly, to the player Zlatan effectively replaced in that same transfer saga, Samuel Eto'o. Before Guardiola had even properly settled into the Barcelona job, the message to Eto'o was reportedly blunt: you're not part of the long-term plan. Not, prove yourself. Not, earn your spot. A door, closed before the season even began. What happened next is the part that makes this case so uncomfortable. Eto'o didn't sulk. He didn't coast. He delivered arguably one of the best individual seasons of his career, goals in bunches, a Champions League final winner, a key piece of a historic treble-winning campaign. By every conventional measure, he answered the doubt in the most emphatic way a footballer can, with performance. It didn't matter. The trust had already been broken before a ball was kicked, and no amount of end product was going to repair it. At the end of that treble-winning season, the peak of Eto'o's Barcelona career, he was used as makeweight in the very deal that brought Zlatan Ibrahimovic to the club. Traded. Not for underperforming. Not for attitude problems that derailed the team. Traded because a decision had already been made about his future before his season even started, and results weren't allowed to override it. That's the detail that should stop you for a second. This wasn't a manager reacting to decline. This was a manager who had already decided the outcome, and stuck to the plan regardless of the evidence in front of him. 2 case studies in, and a pattern is already forming that should worry anyone who thinks, just perform well enough, is a guarantee of security under Guardiola. Performance isn't always the deciding factor. Fit is. Now, to be fair for a second, every top manager makes calls that affect players' careers. Squad building requires ruthlessness. Big clubs move players on constantly, and not every exit is a personal indictment. Guardiola isn't unique in cutting ties with talented players. But what starts to separate his pattern from ordinary squad rotation is how personal, how absolute, and how public some of these fallouts became, and how consistently they follow the exact same shape, across 3 different clubs, over more than a decade. Case 3, Munich, a different country, a different type of player, the same underlying story. Mario Mandzukic arrived at Bayern as a proven, physical, old-school number 9, a striker who scored the kind of goals that come from strength, positioning, and sheer will rather than intricate passing sequences. When Guardiola took over at Bayern in 2013, inheriting a squad that had just won the treble under Jupp Heynckes, Mandzukic was part of that success. But Guardiola's Bayern wasn't going to be Heynckes' Bayern. The possession-heavy, positional philosophy that had defined Barcelona was being installed wholesale, and it required forwards who could function as part of a passing structure, not just a finishing threat inside the box. Mandzukic's game, direct running, aerial power, a more traditional center-forward profile, increasingly looked like a mismatch for what Guardiola wanted from his attacking line. The fallout built gradually rather than exploding all at once. Reduced minutes. A shifting role. Reported friction over tactical instructions that, according to accounts from that period, Mandzukic found difficult to reconcile with his instincts as a striker. Within a year, he was sold to Atletico Madrid, a move that, notably, some reports framed less as Mandzukic choosing to leave and more as the club, under Guardiola's direction, choosing to move him on. 3 different countries. 3 different types of striker. 3 different eras of Guardiola's career. And in every single one, the same underlying calculation: if your game doesn't serve the system, your reputation, your medals, and your continued usefulness elsewhere in football won't save your place in this one. That brings us to a case that isn't about a forward at all, a case that shocked an entire fanbase specifically because of who the player was. Manchester City, summer 2016. Joe Hart wasn't just City's goalkeeper, he was, for years, the closest thing the club had to a homegrown icon in an era of imported superstars. England's number 1. A fan favorite. A player who'd been between the posts for the club's most historic moments, including that title-winning stoppage-time goal in 2012. If any position looked safe from a managerial reshuffle, it was his. It wasn't. Guardiola's very first major decision as Manchester City manager was to essentially declare Hart's game obsolete for what he wanted to build. The reasoning wasn't about shot-stopping ability or big-game experience. By most measures, Hart had both. It was about a specific skill Guardiola considers non-negotiable for a goalkeeper in his system: the ability to play out from the back like an outfield player, comfortable under pressure with the ball at his feet, essentially functioning as an 11th outfielder in possession. Hart, a traditional shot-stopper by training and instinct, didn't fit that mold. And Guardiola didn't ease him out over a season of rotation and gradually reduced minutes the way some of the other cases played out. He moved fast. Within weeks of taking the job, Hart was informed he wasn't first choice, loaned out to Torino, and effectively told his future at the club he'd given nearly a decade to no longer existed in Guardiola's plans. The City fanbase reaction was instant and loud. This wasn't some fringe squad player nobody had strong feelings about, this was a symbol of the club's recent history, discarded within a single transfer window by a manager who'd been in the building for barely any time at all. Whatever loyalty Hart's service might have earned him counted for very little against a tactical requirement Guardiola considered essential. Hart never really recovered his career to the level it had been at before that decision. Spells at Torino, West Ham, and Burnley followed, respectable, but a clear step down from being England's undisputed number one. Whether that trajectory is entirely Guardiola's doing is a fair question. But the timing, and the abruptness of the exit, is exactly why this case still gets brought up as one of the coldest calls of his City tenure, a decision made almost instantly, about a player with years of proven loyalty and quality, purely because his specific skill set didn't match a tactical blueprint. For cases in, and the theme by now should be impossible to miss. It was never really about age. It was never really about attitude, in the disciplinary sense clubs usually cite. It was about one question, asked over and over, across 3 clubs and more than a decade: does this player's specific game serve my exact system, right now? If the answer was no, reputation bought you almost nothing. Which brings us to the 5th case, arguably the messiest, the most public, and the one that turned from a quiet tactical decision into an open, prolonged feud that spilled across the media for years. Yaya Touré arrived at Manchester City in 2010 as one of the most powerful, dominant central midfielders in world football, a player capable of dragging a mediocre team into a good one through sheer individual force, and a central figure in City's early trophy-laden era before Guardiola ever walked through the door. When Guardiola arrived in 2016, Touré was already past his physical peak, and the fit with Guardiola's demand for constant off-ball movement, pressing intensity, and positional discipline was immediately uneasy. Touré's game had always been built more on individual bursts, carrying the ball long distances, arriving late into the box, dictating tempo through sheer presence, than on the kind of tireless, structured pressing Guardiola requires from his midfielders. Under Guardiola, his role shrank fast. Squad numbers were reportedly withheld at one point. Minutes dropped off a cliff. And unlike the other 4 cases, this fallout didn't stay behind closed doors. Touré's agent, Dimitri Saluk, became a near-constant presence in the media throughout this saga, repeatedly and publicly accusing Guardiola of freezing Touré out for reasons that had nothing to do with football, allegations of personal bias that Guardiola firmly denied, but that kept the conflict in headlines for years rather than letting it fade quietly the way most squad decisions do. It became, by a wide margin, the longest and most publicly contentious of these 5 relationships, not just a player being moved on, but an ongoing media war fought largely through a third party, long after Touré's playing time had all but disappeared. By the time Touré eventually left City in 2018, the split wasn't just a footballing decision anymore. It was a story about power, ego, and 2 strong personalities who, according to Saluk's repeated public claims, had come to see each other less as manager and player and more as adversaries. 5 case studies. 5 different eras, positions, and countries. One unmistakable through line: Pep Guardiola's version of loyalty runs entirely through his system. Serve it, and you're indispensable, protected, celebrated. Stop serving it, even while performing well, even with years of service behind you, even as a genuine club legend, and the door closes fast, sometimes coldly, sometimes publicly, but always without much sentiment attached. Now here's where this stops being just a fan theory built from 5 anecdotes strung together. People who've actually worked in and around the game, pundits with no reason to invent a narrative, have said versions of the same thing for years. Gary Neville has spoken repeatedly on Sky Sports about Guardiola's single-mindedness, framing it less as cruelty and more as an almost total inability to compromise his footballing vision for sentiment, even when the player in question has given a club years of service. Ian Wright, discussing the Joe Hart situation specifically, described the swiftness of that decision as one of the more brutal examples of a new manager reshaping a squad in his own image within weeks of arriving, regardless of what that player meant to supporters. Even Jurgen Klopp, a manager who built his entire public persona on emotional loyalty to his players, the polar opposite approach in many ways, has talked about Guardiola's relentlessness as something to be respected and feared in equal measure. And it isn't just pundits sitting in a studio offering hot takes for a segment. Former players who spent years inside dressing rooms. Guardiola has managed to have echoed the same basic sentiment in interviews and autobiographies over time, describing a manager capable of extraordinary warmth and detailed personal investment in a player he trusts, and an almost total, near-instant withdrawal of that investment the moment he stops trusting your role in the team. It's rarely framed as outright hostility. It's framed as something colder than that, an absence, a sudden quiet, a manager who simply stops including you in the parts of preparation that matter, long before any official announcement about your future ever gets made. None of these are throwaway comments from people with an axe to grind. These are people who've watched this pattern up close, across different clubs, different eras, different players, and who keep landing on the same basic conclusion: Guardiola's brilliance and his coldness aren't separate traits. They're the same trait, pointed in different directions depending on whether you're useful to him or not. Let's be fair again for a second, because this deserves genuine nuance, not just pile on. It's easy to build an entire narrative out of 5 cherry-picked examples and call it a definitive character study, and a healthy amount of skepticism toward that kind of framing is fair. Football at the elite level is not a loyalty business. Every top club moves on legends. Every serious manager makes calls that upset fanbases and end careers earlier than players would like. Sir Alex Ferguson sold players at their peak. Klopp himself has let go of squad players who didn't fit anymore. This isn't some unique moral failing that separates Guardiola from every other manager who has ever won a trophy. But here's the detail that keeps this specific pattern from collapsing into, that's just football. It's not the fact that Guardiola moves players on. It's how little performance, history, or reputation seems to factor into the decision once he's made up his mind about a player's tactical fit. Eto'o didn't get frozen out for underperforming, he delivered one of his best seasons and got traded anyway. Hart wasn't given a season to adapt to new demands, he was informed within weeks that his City career was functionally over. This isn't standard squad rotation. This is a manager operating with a level of tactical certainty so absolute that results, reputation, and years of loyalty become almost irrelevant once he's decided a player doesn't belong in the picture he's building. And that's really the twist buried inside this entire story. It's tempting to frame Guardiola as simply ruthless, the way tabloid headlines often do, as if this is some cold, calculated cruelty for its own sake. But the more accurate read, the one that actually explains the pattern across 5 completely different players, positions, and eras, is something closer to obsession. Guardiola isn't discarding these players because he dislikes them personally. In most of these cases, by his own public comments over the years, he's spoken with genuine respect about several of them, praising Ibrahimovic's talent, acknowledging Eto'o's professionalism, crediting Touré's importance to City's early success. The coldness isn't personal dislike. It's something arguably more unsettling, a manager who has convinced himself so completely that his tactical vision is correct that the human cost of enforcing it barely registers as a cost at all. That's the real villain of this story, if there is one, not Pep Guardiola the person, but the uncompromising certainty that comes from being right often enough, for long enough, that you stop questioning what that certainty does to the people who can't keep up with it. And here's the detail that makes this pattern almost impossible to argue away: it isn't slowing down. It isn't a relic of an earlier, more ruthless version of Guardiola that's since mellowed with age and experience. Manchester City's current squad has already seen echoes of it, talented, well-regarded players finding minutes harder to come by not because they've declined, but because a new positional demand or system tweak has quietly moved the goalposts on what useful means. The 5 names in this video may be the most famous examples. They're unlikely to be the last. So where does that leave the actual judgment on Pep Guardiola? Because by any reasonable measure, his results speak for themselves. Multiple Champions League titles. Domestic dominance across 3 different countries. A footballing philosophy so influential that an entire generation of coaches now build their teams around principles Guardiola popularized. Nobody serious is arguing he isn't one of the greatest managers the sport has ever produced. But greatness at this level rarely comes free of cost, and the 5 players in this video are the receipts for exactly what that cost looks like when you're the one on the wrong side of a tactical decision. Ibrahimovic, sidelined for not fitting a Messi-centered rebuild. Eto'o, traded despite delivering one of his best seasons. Mandzukic, phased out across a year for being the wrong type of striker. Hart, discarded within weeks despite a decade of loyalty. Touré, frozen out in a conflict so public it played out through his agent in the press for years. 5 different stories. One identical ending. And a question that doesn't really have a clean answer: is this the necessary cost of building a footballing dynasty, the price of total tactical conviction, or did these players, several of them legends of their respective clubs, deserve more loyalty than a system that saw them purely as pieces that either fit or didn't? Maybe the honest answer is that it's both, at the same time, and that's exactly what makes Guardiola so hard to fully praise or fully condemn. The same uncompromising certainty that lets him rebuild a treble-winning Barcelona around one player, or turn a leaky Manchester City into the most dominant domestic side English football has ever seen, is the same trait that made Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Samuel Eto'o, Mario Mandzukic, Joe Hart, and Yaya Touré expendable the moment they stopped fitting the picture. You don't really get one without the other. The brilliance and the coldness aren't in conflict. They're the same thing, wearing different faces depending on which side of the decision you're standing on. Go back to that opening line about Mikel Arteta for a second, because it's the detail that ties this entire story together. Arteta wasn't cut. He wasn't traded, frozen out, or discarded in a press war. He was one of the players who thrived inside Guardiola's system, absorbed everything Guardiola demanded, and eventually left City to become a manager himself, one who, by his own admission in various interviews over the years, built much of his own coaching identity directly off Guardiola's blueprint. And yet even Arteta, someone who benefited enormously from that relationship, has spoken about how intense, all-consuming, and at times exhausting it was to work that closely with a manager operating at that level of obsession. If the manager's own protégé, someone who succeeded under him, who owes a real chunk of his career to him, describes the experience in terms that carry that much weight, it tells you something about what it must have felt like for the 5 players in this video who didn't succeed under him, who ended up on the wrong side of that same demanding, uncompromising standard. That's really the through line connecting every case study here. It was never about whether these players were good enough for football at the highest level. Ibrahimovic went on to have Ballon d'Or level seasons elsewhere. Eto'o continued scoring at an elite rate for years after leaving Barcelona. Touré was, for a stretch, arguably one of the best central midfielders on the planet. These weren't fringe squad players clinging to a spot they didn't deserve. They were proven, elite-level professionals who ran into one specific obstacle, a manager whose standard for good enough wasn't about talent in the abstract sense at all. It was about whether your specific talent, in its specific form, served his specific idea of how football should be played, in that specific moment. Miss that alignment, even by a small margin, and none of the rest of it, the medals, the reputation, the years of service, carried enough weight to save you. That's also what separates this from a simple story about a demanding boss. Plenty of managers are demanding. Plenty push players hard, criticize publicly, hold high standards. What makes Guardiola's pattern distinct across these 5 cases is the specific, narrow, uncompromising nature of what he demands, not effort, not attitude, not even raw ability, but a very precise tactical fit that some genuinely great footballers simply don't have and, in some cases, structurally can't develop no matter how hard they try. Mandzukic wasn't lacking effort or commitment at Bayern. His entire game, the physical, direct style that made him a World Cup finalist and a Champions League winner elsewhere, was fundamentally the wrong shape for what Guardiola wanted from a forward. That's not a fixable flaw through hard work. That's a mismatch built into the player's identity as a footballer, which is exactly why, once Guardiola decided it didn't fit, there was no version of "try harder" that was ever going to change the outcome. It's worth sitting with how differently these 5 stories might have gone under almost any other elite manager in world football. Ibrahimovic's ego and instinct-driven style has thrived under plenty of coaches who built around his strengths rather than editing him out of the picture. Eto'o's end product over everything approach is exactly the kind of ruthless finishing most managers would happily build a season around regardless of trust issues in pre-season. Mandzukic's physical, direct profile is a template plenty of clubs actively recruit for. Hart's shot-stopping and command of his box would remain valuable to the vast majority of managers who don't require a goalkeeper to function as a de facto sweeper passer. And Touré's individual brilliance carried City to trophies for years before Guardiola ever arrived. These weren't players who simply stopped being good at football. They were players who stopped being useful to one very specific, very unforgiving vision of what football should look like, and that distinction is exactly why this pattern feels less like ordinary squad management and more like something closer to an ideology, one that leaves very little room for anyone who doesn't fully commit to it. So here's the actual question, and I want you to genuinely sit with it instead of just picking a side out of habit. If you were one of these players, a proven, decorated professional, suddenly told your entire skill set no longer mattered, regardless of what you'd already given the club, would you call that visionary management, or would you call it something closer to being used? Drop your take, your verdict, in the comments below. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of story where the disagreement in the comments ends up being more interesting than the video itself. If this broke down something you hadn't fully connected before, a like genuinely helps more than you'd think. It's the easiest way to tell me this kind of deep dive is worth making more of. And subscribe if you want more of this, the real stories behind football's biggest names, the ones that don't make the highlight reels. This won't be the last one, trust me. There are more names, more clubs, more decisions like this one waiting to be unpacked. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.